Welcome back. This week on the Combat Based Podcast, we are joined by Mike Dytri, artist, former MMA fighter, actor, director, skateboarder, entrepreneur, and second-degree Brazilian Jiu Jitsu black belt under Chris Haueter. His current project is Vanguard Kimonos, producer of ultra-high-quality Jiu Jitsu uniforms, clothing, and accessories. Enjoy.
It's like one of those bus huts, where you sit on a bench. And there was like these two really pretty, really young girls sitting there like dressed to the nines. And then this like really mean, really awful looking woman like standing there with them, like talking on the phone.
It's the madam.
And I just was like, this looks like
really?
A sex trafficking situation.
You saw that? Really?
And I like almost stopped and like got out of my car
right,
and went like, are you guys okay?
I've done that too.
Almost got out of my car. And then I was
know
like,
that feeling.
I don't know whether I should say something like, that's a pretty extreme offense. If you got to be like, I don't know. It was really awkward and strange, but
I want to add a pitch to a really cool organization called Deliver Fund. Look them up on Instagram. It's all CIA guys and operators who teach police departments how to spot, recognize, and handle human trafficking.
Yeah.
Because the internet has created, it's like never before. It's a global industry now.
It's horrible, and not to get too far down the hole on this subject because it's not a good subject. But a friend of ours, a good friend of ours, their daughter was involved, and they live locally. FBI is involved, etc. Someone tried to, and good on our daughter's. Well, it was our friend's daughter's friend. Good on her friend's daughter because she was the one who essentially kind of called it out, like 14 years old, like that's probably not right, what you're seeing on the phone, etc. Because she had sort of been learned these things from her mom and dad, but the girl wasn't hurt. She wasn't, didn't get sort of abused or abducted or anything like that.
It was in the early stages.
But it was in the early stages, and it was local, here in Hawthorne, and the perpetrator was in San Diego, and so it's real.
scary stuff.
It's real.
But we got other stuff to talk
Let's
about.
break
talk.
into
Let's
jiu-jitsu.
talk about.
I'm stoked.
Let's
So
talk, Tobin.
Here we are at
Tobin
the garage in Redondo Beach. We're with the legend, Chris Haueter.
Minor legend.
I don't think he likes being called a legend.
I really don't.
He does not.
I like to call you legend.
All right.
He doesn't like it, but let's just make that clear. Tobin likes it. Chris doesn't like it.
Okay.
All good.
I have maybe you can insert another word in place of legend, which I think is appropriate. The venerable Chris Haueter.
Oh,
Venerable.
I like venerable.
Okay.
Chris
We
Haueter.
can do that.
One of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's American Dirty Dozen. With the legend, Melissa Haueter.
I'm not a legend either, but I am the CEO.
The CEO of Combat Based
and
Club.
I will wear that title proudly.
Yes.
As you should.
She
As
definitely
you should.
is in charge of logistics and operations, which is what
I run
wins
the
wars.
business. I
Yep.
run the business.
I think supermom's a good word for you too.
Supermom's fine,
Supermom.
but mom is really hard. I will be the CEO of Combat Base.
Mom's
All right.
the
All right,
hardest.
let's introduce our guest.
Well, we got two more. We got John
Yay!
behind the lens.
Yeah.
We got John behind the lens.
John rocks it.
I'm Tobin. And then today we have a guest, Mike Dytri.
Yay, Mike D.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, Mike.
So we want to hear about
Excited to
Mike's.
sit down.
Good. We want to hear about your history and background and current projects, past projects, and anything you're excited to share about.
Oh man.
Detroit.
Well, let me start with how I know Chris.
Yep,
I think
there
that's
we go.
probably the best place to start. I met Chris via Glenn Chang. We had mutual friends from far back, 20, 30 years ago, 25, I guess, years ago now, almost 30. So sort of a mutual circle, and that was through when I was training at the Raw Gym in El Segundo. But how I met him recently, well, within the last 13 years, was a friend of mine, Glenn Chang. My friend Howard, Lou, brought me to Glenn Chang's dojo. And then at that time, I remember Glenn saying, you need to meet Chris because his wife, Melissa, is training for, I think it was Worlds or something at the time, and you'd be a good training partner for her. You're the same sort of weight and same sort of size. And you should go and meet Chris. And I was like, okay. And I think Howard gave me your number. You said, hey, show up at this place in Redondo Beach. It was John Marshall's place, Triton Gym. Show up here at whatever, 6:30 or whatever. I showed up. I had my gi, I had my belt, and it was Chris and it was Wesley. And so he's like, all right, let's start rolling. We start rolling. And like instantly, like this, I had no experience really in like with gi jiu-jitsu. And instantly started getting just choked out left and right, just collar choke, collar choke, collar choke. And then Chris like, yeah, you got a good base. I can tell you're a wrestler, MMA base, blah, blah, blah. And then Wesley, same thing with Wesley, collar choke. And I was like, oh, this sucks. But it was like hours of grinding, just them two, like sort of round robin. And at the end, he's like, okay, show up to my garage on Sundays. And that was how I met Chris. And it was really, I think my feeling was, it was really nice to meet someone who was, it wasn't about sort of these weirdness that you kind of run across in jiu-jitsu. It was just from there I was like, oh, this is a guy like I like his personal point of view, his outlook, his jiu-jitsu perspective, and that's kind of when I started training with Chris, and he's the one who awarded me my black belt. And yeah.
I feel like I've had a bunch of people say that, and I've experienced that too, that they come here and they meet you and then they're just like, oh, good vibes. Like, this guy's just great to be around. And I feel like that's a strong thing.
I think too, I will say that it definitely does not come from an entirely altruistic space. It comes from an experience of wanting to do a bunch of different things and realizing that those tribes all beefed. And because I want to do all of them, I selfishly want unification. I didn't like that the wrestlers hated the jiu-jitsu guys because I started out a wrestler. I feel like that's my core. And back then, it was much more tribal. And the Rajim guys, I liked all with those guys, but they would shit talk all the gi with jiu-jitsu guys. Of course. And it was like kind of one of those things where it's like, I think, God, if these guys could just experience the gi, they would love it. And if these gi guys could just experience freedom from the hierarchy and what the American model of a gym does, the wrestling room, a boxing gym, they'd love it. And yeah,
I think we have the same sort of mindset philosophically. I think my whole life, I've always done multiple things at the same time. And I've always wanted to experiment and kind of test myself and try different things at the same time, right? I was never one of those kids or people who was always only into one thing. I mean, if you had met me, there has been places where I had met a few people from different parts of culture, right? And they're like, you know him, or you know him, or how do how do you guys know each other? So I think philosophically, was one of the things that hit it off. And in those days at the Raw gym, I had been just kind of getting back into it. I was like, oh, there's this thing, no holds barred. I want to try, kind of get into this, because I had already kind of done that earlier in Japan in the early 90s. I had fought amateur Shuto Class B when I was living there. And then it was like maybe fast forward 9 years later, it was 1999. I made a couple calls. Frank Shamrock said, go down to this place in El Segundo. I'm up north. I was going to be there, but meet this guy. His name's Frank. It ended up being Frank Trigg. So I knocked on the door. He's like, come in. And I was like, as soon as I walked in the door, I was like, okay, I know that this is like, an alpha male sort of environment. Frank comes over. He's like, all right, we practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Show up on Tuesday, bring your, gear, blah, blah, blah. I showed up and I was just like, okay, thrown into kind of that world. And in those days, it was 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. All the sort of world-class jiu-jitsu guys were coming through Raw to train, either to make a transition to MMA or have their first fights in MMA. So I was in fight practice and camps with all, big names, all the guys that would come through Raw. And having those guys, Vladimir Medichenko, Frank, Trigg, Rico obviously was kind of running the practice and coaching. Carl Parisian, all these guys were showing up. Mac Denz, all the guys that were on the team that were showing up at fighters practice, which was this was the practice schedule. Mondays and Wednesdays were stand-up sparring with takedowns. Tuesdays and Thursdays were wrestling with on the ground, sort of ground and pound. And then Saturdays was, kind of more like a freestyle day, recovery. People would come in, it would be open mat, etc. But that was it. It was like week in and week out. And while I was doing that, I had already had sort of an established design business that I was kind of had, to attend to, or I have action sports clients that I was handling their creative and design. So my schedule was I would train during the day and I would do my sort of creative work at night. And so if I had a meeting during the day for one of the clients, etc., I would like fit it in. But that was kind of like my schedule. And it was like that for a good solid 4 or 5 years. And
I also think, I mean, clearly we hit it off because we're both creatives.
yes.
But you were just entering that age where you're too young to say you're old, and too old to compete with the 22-year-old guy who does CrossFit 3 times a day in between.
When I met you.
Jiu-Jitsu, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think part of that was when I met you is I just had my daughter Kaya. My wife is like, I don't want you, in any of these camps anymore. Because I spent a good, after my last fight, which was 2005 or 6, that Pangea Fight Association or whatever.
Yeah, I remember.
I think that was my last fight. And after that, it was a few years of just kind of like, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this thing. I'm kind of too old to do this thing. And I went down, there was these tryouts for Bass Rutten had a gym called Legends in Hollywood.
That's right.
Right. And there was basically tryouts for that team. And so I went there was a tryout at UCLA of all places. And Quentin Jackson was there. There was a couple coaches there who were just watching guys spar. And so I got selected I was like, okay, cool. I'm on the Legends fight team. And it lasted 6 months. They had lockers there, right? It lasted 6 months. And I could see the writing on the wall. I was like, oh, I'm too old to kind of do this now. It just wasn't happening. So I spent a couple of years just sort of milling around. And then my wife was like, I don't want you sparring anymore because I'm starting to kind of have some effects of head trauma. I couldn't remember things. I was starting to stall and stutter on sort of words. Things I wanted to say weren't coming out of my mouth.
I'm like that now.
And no, I hear you. And so that's when I was like, I need to do something, and it's jiu-jitsu. I'm going to put the gi on. It's something I hated to do. And I was always never really respected it in that sense. And that's what I'm going to do. And that was when, I met you, and kind of, you're exactly right. It was just too old to say this, but too young to say that. So it was in this weird era, but it actually segued into the most amazing kind of experience, which led me here, led me here now, in the last few years. Has been probably, now that I'm over 50, have been probably the best, some of the difficult times, but the best time in my life as well, growth-wise, just as a person. And I think a lot of it's attributing through relationships and kind of the experiences that I've had here over the years. This is one of the best places, I swear. I didn't know it in the beginning, in the first few years, but this place meant so much to me. It still does mean so much to me. The experiences with you, training with you, you were one of my favorite training partners, one of the most challenging. And then we'd also have talks not about jiu-jitsu, just about life and psychology and the relationships built out of here. Even, other people, Chimiko and tons of people that I've met here, that it's just a really special place.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking when you were talking about that before, being attracted to Chris, and I feel like it's what we've created here. It's not just Chris, it's the space, right?
Yeah.
And you guys have I was here before the space, and this space wouldn't be here without me. I really don't think it would.
I don't think so either.
And I don't know if you guys know the reason why, that this space was full of car parts and tools when I showed up. And I told Chris, why do we have a garage full of car parts and tools? That should be the mat room. Yep. And so we made it the mat room. And it evolved over time too, because he didn't want to give up his car parts and tools. So for a while, it was only half of the garage was car parts and tools, and half of the garage was a mat, and it had like a ring down the center.
I had a half ring.
And eventually he agreed with me that this should just be a matted space, and then he got really into it and decorated it and did all the stuff, and then we could have more people here and form the relationships.
And at that time, when you did finally get me to pull the trigger, I remember I went to a museum in, I want to say it was the Lansing, Michigan car museum, and I realized that I love vintage stuff, vintage old cars and all that, but I don't love owning them. It's kind of like a boat. They say the two happiest experiences, the day you buy a boat and the day you sell it. And because
Tobin and John are boaters.
the boats are so fun, and you're on your friend's boat, maybe you're diving off, you're doing lobstering, whatever, and you're like, I got to have a boat. And I did that experience, and as soon as then you're worried about it. You're worried about getting the barnacles off it, doing all this stuff. It's like, I love other people's boats, and I realized I love other people's collector cars.
What's that saying? It's like, if it floats, flies, or fucks, rent it.
I like that. Yep.
But we have our own mat room.
Yep. We do. And
which requires minimal maintenance, but it does require maintenance.
And then not long after that, I was making this, like, as a creative artist, like my core art really is sculpture. And I would think, why am I restoring a car? People restore cars all day long. Why don't I create my own things? Right. Like I put restoration and vintage stuff ahead of my own art needs. And then when I finally got the Jeep done, and I'm older now, and it sat in a garage. It was
right before I had Allison.
Yes.
So there was this Jeep that he was putting together with multiple Jeeps.
For 10 years.
Forever. It might have been more than 10 years. I don't know. But when I met him, it was multiple Jeeps back here, and it required a lot of work. And I got pregnant with Allison, and by the time he finally finished it, and you spray canned it, camouflage, right? Cool. Digital camouflage with the rattle can. We drove in it one time, and I was like 8 months pregnant. And we sold it.
And I realized I'm too old to have a Jeep.
That Jeep was parked in your driveway when I first came to the garage.
We had it parked in the driveway for years. And then when I was pregnant, we drove it one time to my grandma's house.
Yeah. I remember rolling up in the driveway and going, check that Jeep out. That's a trippy Jeep.
We never drove it, ever. We never drove it. And then we sold it for a bunch of money, right?
1983 Jeep CJ8, a scrambler body on a 1992 fuel-injected extended frame.
See, that's awesome.
Wrangler. And it was an awesome Jeep, but that thing sat in my garage undone, like I want to say 9 or 11 years. And in that period of time, I went from being young single guy who likes to roll a Jeep with the top off, long board out with the back, to I'm too old to even want to bounce around at 65 miles an hour on a freeway in this unsafe vehicle.
You were like 45.
I was 45, but like, it's not a good kid's car. It's not a good family car.
Once the kid was born, we never drove the car again. It sat there, and I want to say Allison was 6 or 7 when we sold it. Because I have a picture of her holding a stack of hundreds that we got.
That's right.
We sold it.
10,000 we got for it.
It's getting older in age and just sort of growing. It's interesting experience, when you start to have kids and just sort of like this, hopefully you embark on this journey, speaking for myself, of, kind of what does life mean? You didn't really expect to be here this long. Now what's the next chapter look like? What's the next half of the book look like? I don't know if you remember, but I think in the first couple of times, I know I rode my bike here once, but I had Harleys, right? My dad, and just like building cars or whatever, but I had built this one Harley, and when Kaya was 16 months old or 15 months old.
That was a bitchin' vintage bike.
And my parents were in town, and we had lunch, and they left to meet me back at the house, and I filled the bike with gas. I'm going down 190th and Western, and this person pulls in front of me, and I broadside the car. And then after that, Stacey's like, "You're not riding anymore." Yeah. And my ego is like, yes, I am riding. you know, that's what I love to do. I mean, knees in the breeze.
Born to roll.
There's nothing better than riding your bike, you know, up the wherever. But I knew that was probably it, and I sold it, and I haven't been on one since. I mean, maybe later on when they get older I will, but yeah.
Get these kids grown first. I think about that a
Gotta
lot.
be there.
If we can
Gotta be
just
around.
get these kids grown.
Gotta
But
be
I don't
around.
want to like wish it past or anything.
No, not at all.
But it's
Custom Harley is nice to look at, but I don't want to ride one.
Yeah, I love riding them. I love like
well,
building them and
Chris had
putting
a
them together.
thing with his dad. He promised his dad
Yep.
he would never ride a motorcycle.
Well,
His dad had severe trauma because he flew out of a car windshield
Yeah.
when he was young.
My dad, like, I really wanted a Jeep, and I don't remember, it was like $3,500 back then, and I didn't have enough money. And my dad said, and I'm like, look, can I have a loan? And he said, I will buy it if you commit to never ride a motorcycle ever.
Interesting.
Either or not even on the back of it.
Interesting.
And I like paused just a moment. The rebel in me wanted to say no, because I want a motorcycle. I want a BSA. I want an old Triumph. I want some old European bike. And then I said, okay. And then I'm like, I'm glad he did that, because I'm ADHD. And my personality is not good for motorcycles. I like risk. I like when I pay attention and I drive, I'm actually really skilled driver. It's the paying attention part.
That's hard.
It's the day-to-day just driving part that my brain drifts.
I feel
I'm
you.
thinking about 1,000 things at once.
Me too.
That everything but the task of driving is in my head.
That's why I like to drive.
And
when
I
we're
like
in
to
the
drive,
car
yep.
together.
I'm the same way. When we drive family, Stacia's always driving.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I want to hear. Can we back up a little bit? I want to hear about Subfreakie.
What's that?
Was that the
mean?
beginning
Yeah.
of your creative, professional creative journey?
That's absolutely connected to the beginning of sort of the creative part of actually something that was you could say was an actual company or a brand.
I like Subfreakie.
I ever since I was a kid, I had always had, skills of drawing and sketching and stuff. Ever since a young age, I was more sort of kind of on the side of, okay, I had talent with drawing things. I used to copy like my cousin Vince's, his album covers, and he was a really good illustrator too. He'd illustrate like Kiss album covers, like New York Dolls, etc. And so I would just kind of copy his drawings. But then later on, me and one of my high school friends, we started a production company for music videos called Freaky Pig. And we did a couple music videos back in the 90s and really kind of cut our teeth on filmmaking and all that stuff. And then we kind of, we had some ideas that were different. So I broke off and I decided to create a subdivision of Freaky Pig called Subfreakie. And so that was born out of just making t-shirts of graphics that I liked and that were influences from martial arts, influences from music, influences from like art, just themes that interested me was kind of the subject matter of the t-shirts for Subfreakie. And how I did that was in 95, I put together a portfolio after going to the Action Sports Trade Show, and I showed it to one of the guys that worked for Stussy, and he's like, okay, come show it to this guy. This guy ended up being Frank Sinatra, who was the owner of Stussy at that time. Showed him my portfolio.
Sinatra owns Stussy?
Yeah, not the Frank Sinatra, but his name is Frank Sinatra.
Frank was maybe dead by then.
Yeah.
The Frank?
I think, I'm not
Old
sure what
Blue
time
Eyes?
Blue Eyes died, but this was in 95, and he said, you can do graphics for us. And then he told me to go meet this other guy who just opened this shop on La Brea called Union, this guy Eddie Cruz, and I showed him the graphics too, and he's like, oh, you want to do some graphics for Union? So that was kind of the start of my graphic design, like t-shirts. And then from there I was just hustling. Like I was giving it to like professional surfers, skaters, people who I knew that I liked, and they would wear it, etc. And it was just kind of like that guerrilla kind of way of doing things. And that was the beginning of what eventually connected to me being able to kind of prepare today they call them decks, but prepare work to get creative contracts from action sports companies. And the first two were Mosh BMX, which was owned by Giant Bicycles, which ended up going into a Giant Bicycles contract. And then Clive Backpacks, which was a backpack company that I was on the ground floor of, like, kind of starting the identity for. And they had all the, world champion surfers and skaters that were sponsored. Joel Tudor actually was one of the sponsored surfers for Clive Backpacks. This was before he was doing Jiu Jitsu. And I would go down, I would take the photographs of them sort of with the backpacks. I would compose the ads. I would, do the design, the graphic design, the t-shirt graphics, do the whole catalogs. And that was kind of what it was to have a contract at that time. But Subfreakie was like kind of the platform that allowed me to do those things.
How do you get the confidence to start something like that? Because I feel like what you're describing is like a dream career for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you at some point and a buddy said like, oh, let's be producers, and you just started doing it.
At that time, the early 90s, when my friend Forrest and I were doing the filmmaking, the first film he made was called Life is Nice, and that film had Steve Buscemi in it. We filmed it all around the South Bay. We filmed it at like five points over in Hermosa Beach, which used to be Mighty Mart. We filmed it at Veterans Park. We filmed it all. We got all the restaurants in the South Bay.
Shots, yeah.
It was black and white. It ended up getting accepted to a bunch of film festivals. Went to Toronto. Went to we went to all these film festivals. Ended up selling it, making a little bit of money to make our next film. But at that time, we were just film kind of geeks in the sense where we were watching all Jim Jarmusch films. We were watching like Wim Wenders. We were just like film nerds, and just like in the sense where we wanted to make it in Hollywood. And he wanted to be a director. I wanted to be an actor. And so we just did it, right? We just said we're going to figure it out. And I was living in Redondo Beach on Voorhees at the time. In my apartment, we had a flatbed editing kind of table in my apartment, and there was film like all over the floor because we had an editor come in, was cutting the film like in my apartment. It was the most hilarious thing. But at that time, it was like you would have to transfer film and get a negative, and it was a lot of these costs involved. But he, raised money from friends and family. I would raise money from friends and family. We would fundraise or somehow get people to donate, and that's kind of what we did. In terms of the confidence, I think I always kind of had this idea that whatever it was, I felt like I could do it if I put my mind to it. But with that came a ton of luck in terms of the career that I was able to make out of graphic design and from Subfreakie. The luck was I was able to meet someone who showed me how to run a design studio, and I kind of interned for him and worked for him for a year. And it was entertainment design. So I learned kind of how to bid jobs and how to put something together to actually get a contract to actually, make a livelihood at it. So I was lucky enough to kind of meet him, and he was generous to share that with me. I really believe that, luck is half of the equation, if not more than anything that happens to anyone in life.
The third.
It's a third for sure.
Yeah, if not a half. And so
Not a half. Yeah.
there's a lot of, of course, a lot of times it was maybe some sort of blind confidence or whatever, but I feel like, I had that confidence that if I put my mind to it, I could do it.
And was your skateboarding before all of this?
Yeah, I was.
Because I think skateboarding sometimes can give you some confidence where you kind of learn that you can practice something and get better at it.
Definitely, and that's kind of what I meant to earlier when I said I was never one of those kids that was only doing one thing. So I was always into skateboarding and BMX while I was into wrestling and while I was into karate. So it's my whole week as a child growing up from 1974 to about 1983. Literally that long. Every single day I was either going to the dojo, the karate dojo, riding my BMX bike or skating or breakdancing. And it was all filled up with all of those things at every one time. And I happened to be decent enough at skateboarding to get a sponsorship from Going and Brand X and GNS. And I moved here to compete and see if I could do it. And I was in a contest with Jason Lee and Mike Vallely in Arizona one time. And I remember that they were in a heat before me. And when I saw what they were doing, I was like, I'm not that good. So I was only able to get to a certain level. But through that, I met the people that allowed me to say, hey, go meet this guy, show him your graphics. And one thing led to another, and I was able to kind of have doors open and avenues through, just people saying, hey, go meet this guy, and kind of make something happen. But yeah, skateboarding was part of that. And
that's what brought you from Detroit to California?
That's what brought me from Detroit to California, yeah. And then my friend Forrest, he said, I'm going to move there too and do commercials and direct or whatever. So we were kind of like ganging up on that stuff together in that same period of late 80s, early 90s. So it kind of was in that same...
that late 80s, early 90s period, it's like my brain's always trying to imagine, like... It's hard to judge the past because we know how it turned out, right? But when you go back in that phase where all of a sudden all this independent youth stuff was starting to become mainstream.
Like Cross Colors?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I'm trying to think of what was going on.
Independent filmmaking, independent music, the alternative music scene. Like all this stuff was really starting, like a lot of stuff, and here's my LA snobbery, a lot of things that start in either LA or New York, it used to be in the past, within 10 years, it would go global.
Yeah.
So you could see what was coming if you were in New York or LA. You'd be like, wow, in 10 years, they'll be doing this in Wichita and Berlin. But like now with the internet,
it's not going on
it's
like
so
that
instant.
Anymore. Yeah,
absolutely true.
Everybody's dressed the same all over the world.
The
kids are all wearing those Nikes with those old
that 1979 Nike Blazers.
It was absolutely true. Between the years of 1989 and 1992, it seemed like a long time.
Well, the wall came down,
but
the globe was changing. The communism had
I went through puberty.
Yeah, I mean, in those in those 3 years, it seemed like such a long time. But I did. There was so much that happened, and that it seemed like such sort of a hustle between those years. Because in those years, I was living in Hollywood. I was living kind of moving back and forth between kind of South Bay and Hollywood. Lived on 611 South Cloverdale was my friend Forrest's apartment. I lived on the other street, Detroit Street. Jane's Addiction, the drummer from Jane's Addiction lived in the back. They used to practice in the garage.
God, I love
below
Jane's
on the
Addiction.
bottom floor.
So
We were basically sneaking into, and basically knowing all the door guys at all the right clubs at that time, running with that crew because at that time we were like hustling our script and our projects to like producers and agents. I ended up getting this casting call for this movie that Greg Araki directed. It was called Living End. I ended up getting this part. I played this gay hustler, and it blew up. It was like in a matter of 2 years. It was like
film.
It was like it blew up in a sense where he was like sort of on the cusp of like this new queer cinema with all these guys that kind of came after him. And the next thing I know, I had this interview with like, I forget what that film is, or that film show on MTV, but you know that host Kurt Loder. So he was the one who would like, he was the one who interviewed me, and it was for that, and was like during that Johnny Suede. And I just remember at that time I was able to get this agent, Paramount Studios, Brian Schwartzman. I was able to get this manager, Rick Yorn, this all happened in the matter of like 6 months. I auditioned for this like part on Dumb and Dumber. It was a standoff.
You were in Dumb and Dumber?
It was a standoff between me and the guy who got. It was a standoff between me and the guy who got the part, and it was reading for the producer and the director in Santa Monica, and I didn't get the part. And I remember driving home after that, going, "I'm not doing this anymore." And
it's
that was like
crushing.
It was like the last like real chance I had at like doing that. But all that happened within like 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And it was like this club scene because we were trying to promote this club at the time. There's undergrounds that we were going to, literally going underground downtown. You would get in a crate elevator and go down, and then it would open up, and there was these buckets full of like orange juice and whatever, and people were passing out ecstasy, and he was dancing all night. I mean, literally those like days, it was amazing in the sense that it seemed like a lifetime, but it literally was only a span of a few years, and all this culture was happening on top of it.
And globally, I mean,
it was amazing.
Was happening in Eastern Europe as like in the 70s and 80s, Western culture would be smuggled in to whether it was Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Poland. And in 89, well, it's really began in 88 when the people began to rise up against oppression. And like a lot of people say, what really killed the communism wasn't the military and all that, it was culture. Because the youth wanted what we had.
I'll tell you,
skateboards, jeans,
and
Ecstasy.
ecstasy.
No, and they absolutely did, because the next film that we did, which was called "I'm the Elephant, You're the Mouse," ended up getting accepted to the Moscow International Film Festival. We got invited. We had carte blanche. We had
Was
VIP.
that 90?
It was 1994, 5,
okay.
I want to say.
94,
Richard
95,
Gere
yeah.
was the host.
Yep.
He hosted us at a dinner, etc.
Glasnost, perestroika.
And it was just after, basically, they turned from communism to they opened sort of the doors, right? And we were there in Moscow.
The transition.
Yes.
That I might add did not work. Okay, but go ahead.
We were there in Moscow, and it was the most amazing experience. I mean, at that time, I don't know how old I was, but we were just kids at the time. I consider myself a kid. And we were like at this film festival. Our film was there, and we were rubbing elbows with these people, blah, blah, dignitaries, all this stuff. And the experience of that is what you just said is, at that time, there was obviously there was no social media, no internet. So in order to get culture or kind of like pollinate different sort of cultures and bring back things, you actually had to go to these cities and like, whether it was New York or whether it was London, if you were lucky enough to get to London at that time.
Which was always a
and
mecca
experience
of
things.
globalism. Yeah.
So the only other way that they knew is there was a few magazines that were out that you could kind of read the pages of and kind of see what was going on in these other cities, whether it was like in the music scene or hip hop or breakdancing or film or whatever, that you could kind of see what was going on.
Yeah.
But the only other way was like to actually be there and like experience these things. And it was, I swear it's going to make me sound old, but those were I think those were the golden days.
I miss that era, whether you're at an LA newsstand, New York, London, and looking
and the
at
newsstands
all
was
the newsstands.
and the newsstand was my
culture.
I would spend hours a day there
hours at those newsstands
because my office was on Sunset Boulevard and basically Holloway and Sunset Boulevard.
I know that newsstand that
on
you're
the
talking about. Yeah.
It was next to Book Soup.
Yeah.
And I would spend every day there. I would spend at least an hour or two just looking at the magazines.
All
And
the
I would start
art
on the left,
magazines, yeah.
and I would go to the right.
Culture magazines.
I would start on art, fashion, and I would end up at the political review, which was like this thick book that would come out quarterly. And I would just spend hours there every week. And that was like me just soaking in like what's going on in the world.
It was our internet.
Yeah.
Then. Yep.
I miss pre-internet Chris.
Yeah.
I mean, I borrowed that episode of Public Domain to do some research for this episode, and I like sat down on my couch with that thing and like cracked it open.
How good is the experience? Is that?
It was amazing. I had such a good
so
time
much
going through
better
that
than
thing.
looking at Instagram, isn't it?
Oh, it was amazing. It was all
God, it's so
quiet.
much better,
Instagram
yeah.
butts,
Yeah,
Insta butts,
yeah.
Insta boobs.
This morning I watched.
Even the butts were better when it was a magazine.
No, this morning I was going through some stuff in my office, kind of trying to clean stuff out, and I have a few boxes, but they're old kung fu, karate, wrestling magazines from when I was a kid. But also my dad had the subscription to, because the dates on them were from 1969 to 1972.
Wow.
And I have pretty much most of these issues, as I do like skateboarding and thrasher magazines. But I was looking at them, and I was just kind of reading the perspective of how martial arts was written in those days.
It was like magic in those days, right?
Amazing.
Yeah.
It was incredible. So I feel like I've been able to be fortunate enough to kind of experience like these early days. I mean, I was just looking at this picture of my dad in the kitchen and myself. I'm probably 4 or 5 years old, and I'm in this like little pajama gi type thing, and he's in his gi, like practicing kata type thing in the kitchen. And I realized that, you know, most of my life was kind of spent sort of living, kind of trying to get the, you know, I guess recognition and what's the word? Approval from my dad from a lot of things. But I was looking at these magazines and realizing I was fortunate enough to listen or to kind of experience these sort of golden ages of martial arts, which I feel like the early 70s and early 80s were golden, because like the karate guys, the tough guys, those were legitimately tough guys.
They were.
Like legitimately, I don't care what you say about the whole wave of the Gracie changing everything or whatever, those dudes were the really tough guys.
Yep.
And on the
The
street,
kids' classes ruined it, just by the way.
on the street, those dudes were really tough guys. And then experiencing the other sort of like wave and sort of golden era, which was the early Pride days and the advent of the Gracies. I was lucky enough I was in Japan for probably the first 2000, 2001, 2002, probably all the Pride events. I saw all of those. I saw Sakuraba Haueter, I saw Sakuraba Henzo, I saw Sakuraba Heian. Sakuraba Henzo was probably the best by far of any of that, because in my opinion, Henzo Gracie is probably the most talented MMA fighter of the whole Gracie family.
At
bar
that
none.
time, I still argue Hickson's better, but that's a whole other argument.
Okay. That's a whole nother
That's a whole
segment.
other, yeah.
Because Hickson was before Henzo. He's older.
Hickson was a little before Henzo, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so I was
an overlap, but-
fortunate enough to be there and like see those events. In the experience, you'll hear it and you'll read about it, but the experience of actually being there was two venues. There was either Saitama Super Arena or there's Tokyo Dome. But the experience of being in the auditorium with that many people during a fight like that, it was like watching gods fight gladiators fight at that time, because it seems like now the UFC, as much respect for those fighters, or for the fighters as I have, because it's a different, now it's evolved. It's a different sort of sport game, if you want, and they deserve all the respect in the world. But that at that time, I feel like you had the feeling like you were watching like it literally sort of like these hero gods sort of fight. And
It was like
Well, it was a new thing too.
It was
right.
now it feels
A
like
novel.
now
It was novel.
It was novel, and now it feels like the UFC is now it's a sport. So it's like it's really diluted. There's so many
Highly
fighters.
regulated. And
There's just
everybody is an MMA fighter.
I mean, when you think about the UFC roster, there's hundreds of guys on the UFC roster. At that time, you had a stable.
It was a very small crowd.
You had a stable
and it felt like
you had a stable of 30 fighters from all over the world.
And in the early days, to me, what it felt like was the transition from backyard fights, back alley fights, garage fights, suddenly becoming a spectator sport. And I didn't think it would last. I thought there's no way it'll get banned. So someone will get killed. This is just, it seemed like we were going towards the fall of Rome more than a heightened amount of culture. But the Japanese audience curated it in such a respectful way, unlike the Western audience, which beer drinking.
MMA.
Why didn't you punch him? It's like the Japanese watched it like golf.
Yeah,
they gave respect to the art and the things, and the American audience watched it like soccer hooligans.
Completely different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Totally different experience.
They're the worst in Europe. God.
Oh, are they?
Oh,
okay.
God.
Yeah, they're pretty mean. I've seen a little bit.
Totally.
Of that.
Totally different
Europe
experience.
is bad. It's like the Bloods and Crips in Europe. Like they get killed in the stands. Like it's.
I was literally sitting there, and probably the second deck. Probably where our seats were, and I'm talking. Let's talk about the Henzo Gracie Sakuraba fight, for example. Probably the second tier at Saitama, and there were moments in the fight, literally, where it was as quiet as this room right now.
Yep.
And you could hear the feet. You could hear the feet shuffling and the leather gloves on the skin and things like that, and the audible sort of sounds, but that's all you would hear. And there was 80,000 plus people in that auditorium. Oh, wow. I get chills just thinking about it now, because it's one of the most crazy experiences.
Oh yeah, John being Japanese, is that what you're asking him?
You could see that? I could see that. John's Japanese.
And then plus, like in the early Jiu Jitsu days, my first black belt match, the one I won, there was 4 mats happening. They announced the fight, and all the mats stopped, and ran over to my mat.
To watch the white guy?
And Hickson walked out. Yep.
The American?
And you could hear a pin drop. It wasn't like it is now, where like crowds are screaming and yelling. It was this quiet thing where like I remember like as I passed his guard, realizing how silent it was. Like, God, this is quiet. And I could see Hickson's foot as he was moving around. And I remember in my mind thinking, God, don't fuck this up. Hickson is watching, don't fuck this arm bar. And he kind of like baited the arm bar, and I didn't take it. I'm like, no, I ain't taking that. And I squeezed it in and got it perfect. And yeah.
Where was this?
That's
That was
amazing.
in
That's
Orange
amazing.
County, I think.
That's an amazing story. I think the only experience I had with Hickson watching was I fought in a smoker at Raw in 2005.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you were there or not.
I remember Ross. I don't think I was there, but I remember one of those I
It
was
was
at.
super crowded.
Yeah,
I mean, packed.
elbow to elbow people.
Hickson, because he brought Kevin Casey, and Kevin Casey was supposed to fight this guy, and he ended up saying, no, I don't want to fight this guy. But Hickson stayed with Heron and Henner were there too. They were young. But they were there on the side. And I remember looking over before I walked on, and I was like, oh, Hickson Grace is there, like in the front row, like watching. I was like, I need to kind of put on a good show and like do my best.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was an interesting experience.
It was just, I mean,
your
for me,
experience
and
what
of
you were
course,
saying in terms of how you kind of like were aware of his sort of presence and sort of watching him there and sort of seeing sort of his feet and saying, don't fuck this up, or that's a really
Jean-Jacques picked me up after the fight, and it was like, yeah, I was like, thank God I won that. That's all I could say, right?
Question about that. So after that experience, and
Yes.
after that event, and after that victory, how did they sort of treat you? Sort of how were you received after that? What changed?
This is what I will say regarding that. I mean, obviously, one view when you zoom out, especially then, there was I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but a protectiveness amongst Brazilians, like Brazilian v. America, right? But my coaches, like whether it was the Machados, the Gracies, we were them. Like it
You were
was
the same team.
We were the yeah,
They weren't rooting for the Brazilian
were-
from
right.
the other team.
They were rooting for
you.
us. And
Yeah.
so it only seemed that way if you were an outside fan chanting USA, USA. But if you were in Hickson's head or Hegan's head, they were on my side. Yeah.
You know, I'm glad that you said that, because I think a lot of people think that, and I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand that.
Yeah.
But when I think it comes to jiu-jitsu, and this is kind of my experience with jiu-jitsu, just even in recent years of working in jiu-jitsu industry and kind of starting a brand and doing design for other brands and working with Gracie Barra, I really feel like the team is paramount to your nationality or wherever you come from. The team is
It becomes
priority.
a whole entity.
Yeah, the
in
team
and of itself.
is priority.
The way that it splits, though, is like if you're competing at IBJJF, you better be in the right team, you know?
Yes.
And like Gracie Baja and whatever comes before like Machado.
Because they own the show.
Yes, because they own the show. So
You know what? I have to push back on that, just in my experience, and I can only share my experience. I've witnessed several occasions where I would have thought that to be true, like actually being there in that environment at Worlds or at Pans, and would expect that to happen in terms of, you see the competitor, they're the Gracie Barra team, you see the other competitor, they're maybe even a smaller team, or maybe some team you never heard of before, and expecting the call to go a certain way. And whether it was the referee or whether it was whatever it was, it just didn't go that way. I feel like that's changing.
yes.
I feel like it's changing, and I feel like they have no choice.
They have.
But
They have to change it. But when he was competing and
That's a
I
different
was
story.
competing,
That was a different world.
it was still that way.
Apples,
Now I
oranges.
could see where, if they want to continue to legitimize themselves.
It was
and-
corrupt.
It
was absolutely
because
correct.
even
Yeah.
your coaches told you.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
did your
Yeah.
coaches tell you, Chris?
But yeah, I remember for the first pans, Hegan delivering this seemingly really long speech about how if we score, you have to look at the referee. Make sure you look into his eyes. Make sure you do not move your position until you see his hand. And he's like, and I'm thinking, guys, he's awfully like intense upon it. By the second match, I saw, oh, they could barely do anything, ref's hands up, and you could totally score, pull it off, and you'd get robbed. And it was
I'd been
was
robbed
blatant.
too, more than one occasion.
You'd been
and
robbed
you have
blatantly,
to win
and I'd been robbed
decisively,
blatantly.
which means you have to submit them.
Yes.
I wonder if what you just
Jean-Jacques was, because he was head coach of Baja, had a falling out with Carlinos, came over to the U.S., and from that point on, whenever he would compete, his goal was to submit, not score points, because he knew he would get robbed. If it was a draw, they would raise it. So
it wasn't just a Brazilian American thing. It was a being on the right team.
Yes, it was
you have to be on the right team.
Yep.
yeah.
Mafia style beef.
Yeah,
is
it's
what
changed
it was.
so much. I mean, I remember competing a few years back, and the referee on my mat was a black belt that I had trained with at a different school, not even my own school. It was a guy that I had trained with.
But he'd recognize you. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we knew each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as my match came up, he got out of there and brought another ref in.
So he wouldn't be biased. That's
just
very nice.
so that I couldn't come back. And
Very nice.
Yeah, there's no, So they probably have rules in place now to account for that.
I mean, I think
good.
I think jiu-jitsu is in a period right now where there's a lot of change happening in jiu-jitsu overall. Not only
The branches are really growing now into all kinds of areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see promotionals on the promotional side. You definitely see the rise of other promotions outside of IBJJF.
Yes,
like
thank God.
Like the AGP,
Yep.
AJP, and of course, I think we talked about this years ago, where we knew that they were, the Emirates regions were going to be pouring a lot of money into their programs and instituting it as mandatory in school systems, et cetera, because, this was just something that I had learned through designing and kind of handling the production for that brand Storm Kimonos. They were dealing with some of those people, and I had learned at that time, and we had talked about it, that they were pouring a ton of money into it, and they had a long game plan. They said in 10 or 15 years, we are going to be the premier, where, what IBJJF is now. And
there's a lot of areas, besides oil, that they have 20-year plans.
Yeah, and I think jiu-jitsu is one of them,
Yes,
honestly,
it is.
because they have a lot of their, premier people who are Emirati royalty, who are taking a huge interest in it.
Well,
so there's that.
So when I was a purple belt, I was at Nelson Montero School, who later won Abu Dhabi and IBJJF and all that. A peer of the
Nelson's guy,
and awesome guy.
Yeah.
And one night we were rolling in a newly opened little tiny academy because we weren't his garage, and these Arabs came in, and clearly the bodyguards got loner geese and came out, and of course we mopped them up. Within a week, Nelson came in with this, I remember his ear-to-ear smile. He's like, guys, I'm moving to Abu Dhabi. I just got $1 million contract, and you guys have to run it while I'm gone. And I remember thinking, I missed my prince by 2 belts. He got the prince, right?
Yeah.
And it was in that early phase of Abu Dhabi. And so they would find the guys who were good and hire them to come over. And it was first the staff of the prince who, and I don't know a lot about their culture, but it's one of those patriarchal honor cultures. And there's rivalries between the princes and rivalries between Arab families. So it's very much matched the culture. And you could just see it gel in a very mass way. Even though religiously it's opposite,
Yeah.
but culturally they're very, very close. And it's a
Yeah. I think
Except the Brazilian women wear hardly any clothes, and the Muslim women wear lots of clothes.
that's true. That's an area where they're distinctly different.
yeah. Yeah.
And unless it's in a private Arab party.
So
That's
you
right.
got all this grassroots experience with culture and art and activities like skateboarding and MMA and Jiu Jitsu. And that sort of funneled you into being an art director for brands.
Mm-hmm.
And you understand how brands can impact culture and how art impacts culture.
And how culture impacts art.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's kind of one of the main things that was great about when you and I first met. We would, all of our conversations would kind of they would maybe be a little bit of jiu-jitsu, but it was mostly about art and politics.
Well, Chris hates talking about jujitsu.
Yeah, it was mostly. It's
Let's
about
just be
art,
real.
It's about art, music, culture, and yeah, those things, and that's one of my favorite things, or that's what I like to do. And so, to your question, yeah, I was how that connected, or how those dots connected was, like I said before, I had always kind of been the type of person that was doing kind of multiple things at once, and it kind of gave me the opportunity to have the luck to be introduced to people to actually make a living and kind of like make a livelihood out of this. And for the jiu-jitsu part about it, the combat sports part about it, the reason I was able to be introduced to Adidas Combat Sports, for example, was a friend of mine, Ed Suarez, who is a manager for, he was a manager for Anderson Silva at that time. He owned the Black House. I was training at the Black House during practice one day, and after I got out of the shower, he said, "Hey, I have a friend who's coming into town. He needs someone to do art direction and graphic design for their brand. It's Adidas Combat Sports, and it's their boxing program, and they want to start a jiu-jitsu and MMA program, and I want to introduce you to them." So I was introduced to them via Ed, and that began the relationship with them. And at that time, Adidas was in the middle of offering an MMA license to the licensee, which owned all the combat sports licenses. And so they started an MMA program. And so I was able to kind of get in there, design product, understand what the athletes needed as fighters. I was able to bring in Luke Rockhold, Robbie Lawler, and have a team, a couple of guys that I worked with to facilitate that. Got off to a great start. First year was awesome. The product was great. Things were going good. Robbie got the UFC belt. And then that was the year when the UFC decided to institute mandatory uniforms.
Oh, that was the worst idea. Ugh.
And the funny thing was, so we flew to Vegas. We went to the UFC headquarters, and we sat down with them and pitched basically kind of the idea to get the contract for the uniform, to be the official sort of uniform, to have Adidas as the uniform for the UFC. We didn't know it, but a week before, Reebok was there and pitching the same thing. And I come later to find out, and this was through the politics of how Adidas was structured at the time. Their AG Corporation owned Reebok and Adidas, and the higher-ups in Germany still did not want MMA associated with the brand Adidas.
Right,
so
because
they
it was a tacky brand.
So they pulled the license from the. They pulled the authority to have the license, so we were kind of out of the deal. We didn't know it, but we were trying to get the job, or to get the contract, but we were already working against the wall. So they said Reebok is the one who's going to do that. So Reebok ended up getting that contract, and the designers from Reebok a month or two later were calling me saying, "Hey, dude, we don't have any idea about like what kind of product these guys need. Can we like hire you to like design a capsule or collection or whatever, just so we know kind of like basically what to do?" So that's kind of what happened with that. And later went on to just more focus on the Adidas boxing program. And to this day, I still am friendly with them and work with them. And I'm currently right now working on a small collection of Adidas Jiu Jitsu, because we're going to kind of make a sort of a re-entry into the U.S. market. And I was able to connect them with Gracie Baja team 4 or 5 years ago. So they had sort of been making uniforms for Gracie Baja for the last number of years. And I was kind of able to put those dots together and kind of work on that product and touch that product and sort of make that happen. It was good.
What's your current like major thing? Like, what's your main primary project that you're working on these days?
Well, Vanguard, which is the brand I started in 2018, which is Jiu Jitsu Kimonos, Jiu Jitsu product, and kind of the DNA, but I have sort of visions of it kind of going outside of.
It's a quality
jiu-jitsu.
gi.
I think it's I love it. I think it's great.
It's a
my
high
favorite.
It's
Fave.
It is a
I only
high
wear it.
quality
I
gi.
only wear Vanguard.
Well,
Thank you.
unlike a lot of those other gis, they fit you well.
It fits me well. Well, maybe because my friend over here has a similar size. The A1 fits well. I wear an A1.
It makes me happy when I see people wearing it and when I see you wearing the product. And I put a lot of hard work into it. I mean, I think one of the things that again was just sort of a great opportunity was I was able to, in the beginnings of the Adidas stuff, because they make most of their gis in Pakistan. So I was able to go to Pakistan and really see kind of like the inner workings of how they make stuff there. And honestly, I wasn't too fond of it. And when I came back from there, I said I would never make product there in Pakistan just because of the environment and the way that they sort of treat their sort of labor force and what I witnessed.
It's brutal.
And then later on, I started making designs and kind of developing for Storm Kimonos, and they made their product in China. So I went to China, saw the factory there, and met a person there that when I left Storm, I took that person with me, who is essentially my development partner, who's based in Hong Kong. He's a New Zealander, but he's based in Hong Kong. And he's kind of the one who's my right-hand man. He makes stuff happen. He's the one who's sort of like QC and QA. And so when I was able to go there and we set up a factory where, look, I'll take this business. We'll give you the opportunity of making thousands of gis a month for Gracie Baja, but you got to take Vanguard too, and you can't take any other brands and make for any other brand. So we have our exclusive facility there, and it enables me to kind of do things that other brands can't do, in a sense where I learned a lot over the years of trial and error, of making pants, making different pants, making jackets. So I've seen it all. I've kind of worn it all and tested it all. So I feel like I know what works the best with Vanguard, and at least for my sensibilities, for what I like. And I know that there's other people that like it too. And I'm not trying to make, a gi for everybody that everybody likes, just for people who like what I like. And I think that's enough. I'm not trying to be this biggest brand. I just want to make the best gi, and for the people that appreciate a really good gi.
And one of these days, you're going to help me make another Run and Magic kimono.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want a combat base ski
And a combat
by
base.
Vanguard. That's what I want. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But I love the quality. I love the feel. It's lightweight. It fits well, and it's beautiful. The designs, I really love, especially the that blue one with the purple accents. I think that the accents and the designs it's not, it's just beautiful enough. Some stuff is over the top, too much. I think it's got just the right amount of beauty.
Nice.
That I enjoy.
Yeah, I remember. So when I was a new black belt, what was in was Krugans and Atama.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took a gi, a plain white one, and I put on a minor threat patch, a black flag patch, an ace of spades patch, and then
Flames, was that the one that had flames on it?
I had flames on it, and that inspired Ryan and Scott to make Lucky Gi.
No doubt.
And that was the first American looking gi. And it was super cool. And then, that kind of began the
I wish I would
skateboardization of gis.
I wish I would have met you earlier on, because I feel like I can see that, because I know I know what you're talking about, and I can see that connection there.
I used to call it my lucky gi too.
And I can see, I see that connection, and that absolutely makes sense. But lately in the last number of years, you've definitely become more of a traditionalist in the sense that you prefer only white gis. You rarely, if I've ever even seen you wear another killer gi besides white.
Every Monday and Wednesday night, I wear a gray one.
Maybe a gray one.
Interesting.
And I was surprised when I saw you a few weeks ago at class going, oh, he's wearing a gray gi, because...
But it's only because that's the gi.
That's the gi that they have.
I wear the one they have.
But what I'm saying and what I mean by that is like, if we had gotten together, and this is just, I'm going to say this really quick and move on, but if we had gotten together back then, because you were more of like outwardly, let's do it, and then I could have designed it, we could have kicked ass.
Yeah, we could have
just took over the world.
If we would have done everything like 30 years ago, we'd be killing it.
Right?
Jesus.
It's never too late.
Not even 30. Like
it's not too late. You could do a remake of that of Chris's Lucky Gi.
I have to also add in here that when I did start Vanguard, I knew I wanted to do an amalgamation between what I had designed for the Adidas gis, what I had designed for the Storm gi, because at that point I felt like the Storm gis were the best gis made.
They were, and I used to only wear Storm when Mike worked for Storm.
Yeah, at that point I feel like I had done enough. I spent like a good solid 3 years making the best competition gi ever. Like you could set it next to any gi and no gi could stand up. But I was like, I don't want to do that same thing. So I also took this gi that I got from Howard, HCK, Vanguard Combat Kimonos, and I set all those three on the floor, and I was like, I'm going to combine all these elements into what is now Vanguard.
Howard's lightweight gi, that first one he made, was awesome.
Yeah, Howard and I are good buddies. We go back a long time. He's he's a character in his own right, and kind of like he's a venerable personality in his own right, with the original sponsor of Randy Couture and Lillian and all those guys, and Inoue's and those guys that were wearing HCK back in the day. But when I had first asked him for a gi, he gave me a gi. I was like, I'm going to compete in a jiu-jitsu tournament. So he's like, all right, here's a gi. And I was like, I don't know what belt I am. What belt do you think I should be? He's like, I don't know, let's talk to Barrett. See what Barrett says. And I went to Barrett's in Hawaii, blah, blah, blah. And I was there, me and Stacy were there. I went and rolled with Barrett, and I got back, and he's like, Barrett says you're a purple belt. So he gave me a purple belt. So I went and competed in that, and that was the first gi that I had for years. And I think that was the gi that I wore when I first met you. I wore it here a couple of times. There was a black one, a white one that I had. But it was a combination between HCK, the Adidas gis, and the Storm gis. So that's what Vanguard essentially is.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
The tech.
Yeah. My first gi was HCK also.
Yeah. I like those. I got to admit, I hated, I think one of the best things that IBJJF ever did, maybe it was CBJJF as well at the time who started, was weighing in with your gi.
Oh, yeah.
Because before that, people would wear the heavy, choke-proof, thick collar gis. They were obnoxious. There was no measurement of the sleeve. They would fit like a tight Armani suit. The choke-proof collars. I remember in the Hawaii, I think in 99 pans, the two black belts are going at it, and that they stopped, and I could hear arguing, yelling. A bunch of guys ran in, and they found woven into his collar a stainless steel bike cable, making it a permanent choke-proof. Like it was that blatant. And
that's insane.
And so the collar choke was becoming a lost art, like really quickly, because you couldn't choke with those thick fucking collars. And because when I started in Horion's garage, we were wearing these thin, almost karate collar gis. And the chokes were easy.
Yeah.
Loop choke and all that. And the judo gis were too thick.
Yeah.
You couldn't get a good collar choke.
Yeah.
But the Gracie garage gis were awesome. And then all of a sudden they shifted. And I remember thinking, no, we're going to lose the fucking choke. We're going to lose. And then when they made the sleeves longer, suddenly Spider Guard became a thing because the equipment changed. And the pant passing became a thing because the equipment changed. And so it's kind of like whether you pump the football up to 15 pounds or 13 and a half changes the way it kicks over the thing. Like, in some ways, a little bit of regulation is a good thing. And I'm glad they regulated the gi finally, because it was ridiculous when it wasn't regulated.
Regulate that cheating.
Those are all really great. Those are all really great insights that I I don't know if I'm necessarily put together, but yeah, those are all really great insights. They make complete sense.
And it's that
Even
same.
Even in the early judo days, because I was, was really into judo when I was younger and karate as well. I went to Detroit Judo. There was this older guy there, this older sensei, is John Osaki, and he used to wear this gi that I remember when we were like practicing around door, and I remember grabbing the lapels thinking like, man, like this is like, it feels like you're like, you can get a really good grip.
You're
on
holding
this
a rope.
gi. Yeah, you're holding a rope. And that's kind of how I felt when I put the Howard gi on, because they were really thick collars in the Howard gis. Mm-hmm. And that to me was like, you can't really choke somebody with that thick of a collar. And that's what I appreciate now, seeing even in competitions now, in IBJJF competitions, is I really appreciate seeing people finish with a collar choke. Mm-hmm.
This is what we wore. There's no spider guard.
No.
With that.
That was amazing.
You can choke with this lapel. And that was what we started with. Then it went to the thick, longer sleeves. Then it went to what we have now, which is a much better product.
What brand is on that one?
I have no idea.
HSK or whatever?
That's
Royal
great.
Fight Silver. But that was the gi that we started with.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, let's move on to this next little segment. We have a question and answer segment.
Cool.
So we've had a lot of great people that have interacted with us online on the YouTube comments. And,
Thanks, guys.
And email, yeah. So if anybody ever wants to have their questions answered, they can email podcast@combatbase.com. But we have this really great question from Emery Eccles, who's a black belt.
One of my black belts, retired a police captain.
Yep. So Emery Eccles asks, once you got your black belt, Chris, you never really associated your garage training kingdom with Machado Jiu-Jitsu. In fact, you've even had the unaffiliated slogan coined for a while. You always talked very positively about Hegan and the Machados and never downplayed your lineage, but did not necessarily market yourself as Machado Jiu-Jitsu. Many black belts will use their former coach's name/academy as part of their own academy's name logo association, but you never really did. Why is that?
Well, God, I think when I was a purple belt and was first learning about the history of Gracie, the Jiu-Jitsu, I don't know whether it was John Machado I asked or Hegan, because it was shortly after they had changed their last name from Gracie to Machado, because when I met Hegan, he was Hegan Gracie. And in that culture, kind of like how Hodger with Gracie's really Hodger Gomez. And it's a patriarchal honor culture. And I am a personality type of an observer/journalist more than a participant, a joiner is part of it. And I always kind of thought in my ideal, everybody would have their own name, not carry on but at the same time, you got to respect your lineage, right? So in other words, I remember asking, why is it called Gracie the Jiu-Jitsu and not Maeda Jiu-Jitsu? Why didn't they carry on their lineage, right? So when it came time for me, like there was a lot of people going, why don't you call it Haueter Jiu-Jitsu? And to me, that just sounded horrible. And for a long time, I had no idea what name I wanted it to be. I absolutely wanted to respect my coach's lineage, and all my art, you'll always see Machado in there. You'll see Hickson now in there, because I want to give that. Like, that is clearly Hickson-esque. But yeah, I never wanted it to be named after me, and I didn't want to name it after someone's family name. So we got a combat base.
And another thing is, you didn't necessarily want to be a jiu-jitsu instructor.
No, I didn't want to be a jiu-jitsu instructor.
He didn't want Haueter Jiu-Jitsu because this wasn't his dream job.
I was going to be a robbery homicide detective, and I ran into a painkiller habit. But that's a whole other story.
That's another episode for another time. But yeah, that's
I was going to solve crimes.
I think that's one of the things I really like about you is what you how you framed that in a sense where what did you say you're a journalist but not a
Observer, not
Yes.
a joiner.
observer joiner. I feel like I like to think of myself that way too, while giving respect to obviously
Yes.
the people you need to give respect to. And I think that's kind of a similar. Wouldn't you say that's sort of a
Mentality?
similar mentality and vibe with a lot of people that come through here and that are here in this
Absolutely.
environment? And I think that that's what's that's cultivated by you guys and you too.
And
That's what
over
makes it special?
time, by circumstance, because this is what we collectively ended up doing together, which was neither one of our vision for our future.
No.
Because this is how it evolved, I thought that we could bring something that was more like that, where everybody's an individual, their individual expression, call yourself what you want to call yourself, wear what you want to wear, but that we could be a club called the Combat Base Club.
And by that same token, I think it gives the people that are involved or that are participating in that club and that are in that environment, it gives them the license and freedom to feel proud to fly the combat-based flag, like I do personally, right? Like I'm one of those type of people that kind of like yourself. I like and I want to show the respect to whatever, but I don't necessarily want to fly like a flag on my chest of a brand in a sense, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like there's not too many brands that I'll wear a t-shirt or whatever, but I feel good about wearing a combat-based t-shirt, if that makes sense. And to me, the t-shirt has been, ever since I was a kid, the number one sort of, that tells you a lot about the person, what t-shirt they're wearing, right?
And it's like
it says a lot about the person.
I mean, as kids, even if you were sponsored by Sims or Road Rider Wheels, you could wear someone else's shirt. Like the skate surf world, you weren't bound to a tribe. And in this martial arts world, it's like you were bound to a tribe. It felt stifling rather than freeing. And I think the combat-based spirit is a spirit of inclusion rather than exclusion.
Yeah.
A spirit of you are welcome here, even if you want to be tribal. You're welcome here.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have people from very tribal academies that come through and roll with us. It's all good.
I've got black belts on the far right. I've got woke black belts. And to me, they're all welcome. You know, that's the spirit of inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. That's the feeling I get from people, is that they generally respect you because you didn't force them to respect you. That's the general feeling. And it's like...
That would be fascism.
That's the art. Yeah. That's the art.
Fascism. We're the anti-fascists.
But we're not Antifa.
That's the art.
We're anti-fascist.
But not Antifa. Yeah, don't get that confused.
Yeah, don't get that confused.
I think Street, Train Sport, Practice the Art is probably one of the best kind of slogan encapsulations for you anywhere. I mean, there's a lot of people who come up with, things, saying, slogans or whatever, but that in itself is so perfect for you and as an extension of you, but also as a concept in and of itself, not even attached to you.
Yes.
Which I think is so great, and because I'm such a snob about that type of stuff.
And even street
which
culture.
Is great. Yeah.
Like, think street doesn't just mean street fight. It's street culture. It's graffiti. It's lowbrow art. It's pop culture. It's underground music. That's thinking street. It's thinking punk rock. It's rather than thinking tribal.
Yeah.
It just seems like a more equitable approach for both people, which is a more healthy relationship where both parties in a relationship feel respected, where you give people the opportunity to be who they want to be and respect them for that, and in return they respect you. And I feel like that's the ethic behind the way you do what you do, instead of forcing somebody off the bat to respect you immediately. You're giving and taking a little bit back and forth.
Yeah.
And that seems like
And some people,
more sophisticated way.
some people need the other way, right? Some people have been with us and have left because they need something more structured, someone who's going to tell them what to do, what to wear, how to train, what's your curriculum, all this kind of stuff. People need that, right?
It's all good.
That's why
And
it
that's
has
all
a
good
big
too, yeah.
market for that.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Goodbye.
It's all good.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
All right, so our little finishing segment, Mike. This is a little fun question for you. Do you have hopefully you got to think about this ahead of time. I think I sent it to you. But do you have a fight that you wish you never fought in your life?
Oh, and I don't remember you sending that to me. This is really spontaneous.
On the spot.
It could be anything. It could be a work thing.
A regret.
I was thinking about like fights with your spouse.
That could
I have a lot of
I have a
those.
lot of regretted fights with my spouse and my son.
And children. Yeah.
I know. I was like trying to think of how to answer this question. I was like, I can't. If someone put me on the spot,
There's
I
some
wouldn't come
fights
up
I
with it.
regret.
Yeah, no, this is on the
Fighting the cops
That was Chime.
did not end well.
Yes, absolutely. I wish that I wish that I didn't fight myself for so much of my life. I think only since around the pandemic time, around 2020, 21, is when it started to break, and I realized I couldn't fight myself any longer, and I wish I didn't fight myself for so long.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. Wow.
That's a good answer. Yeah. That is who we ultimately fight the most, isn't it?
I know.
Especially when you're an introspective intellectual. Because you become your own worst judge.
Yeah.
And you're constantly judging yourself and your behavior.
I know.
Always.
Whenever I'm having like life problems, I'm always like, I know this is just me. You know? I'm like internally just like, yeah. I feel
No,
that.
yeah. I mean, I think, I think there's so many parallels between kind of jiu-jitsu and kind of what brings us all, on the mat together, and life, and kind of just doing life. And I've been using this phrase a lot lately, is that it's a mixed bag, right? So there's times in life where, and there's times right now, it could be any one of us in the room, where you may have experienced some really bad news or something really bad in the last day or two or today, but then at the same time something amazing, right? So that phrase you use, that we live in a non-binary world? Well, I think about that in the sense of mentality, where it's not binary, so it's not black or white, it's gray, and it's a mixed bag all the time, and that's life. So it's like you could be really sort of down or sad or hurting or feeling really bad about something, but at the same time, if somebody asks you how's things going, it could be really great too, because you just witnessed something of your kids or your relationship or whatever. So there's this whole sort of thing, and I realize that now, that I always wanted it to be, it's either this or it's that, and it was a kind of reflection of what I was doing to myself. Is if it's not this, it's that, or it's either this or that, but it's both. It's all.
Yeah,
together.
suffering is a perception.
Yeah, I think suffering is life. I mean, I think suffering is life, and not suffering in the way that, suffering, but suffering is life. And I don't think you are really living if you're not suffering to some degrees in some ways, because suffering, you grow out of suffering. And if you're not growing,
Challenging
you're kind
yourself.
of dying.
Challenging yourself.
Which, that whole episode with Chime regarding AI, like one of the things that no matter how human-like we try to make AI, can it suffer? Can it feel pain? That's like what makes us alive.
Yeah.
That the very thing that we're constantly trying to repress and push away is also the very ingredient that makes us happy and live, and makes us grateful for what we do have.
Embrace.
I think more people now, and this is maybe one of the positive things about social media and kind of the age that we live in now.
Because there are some positives.
There are, absolutely. It's kind of,
It's a mixed bag.
It's a mixed bag. The positive part is I think more and more people are starting to wake up to the concept that, there's those times in life, of the experiences, or, episodes where you're like, God damn, why did that happen? Or God damn, why did they do this? Or why is this happening to me? But it's those times that hopefully can cause growth, evolution, expansion. And I feel like now more than ever, more people are starting to kind of like wake up to this and at least see this. It might resonate today, it might resonate in 5 years, but at least this is kind of out there on the sort of like lexicon of like social media. And I feel like that's a good thing. Only good can come from that.
Nice. That's a great spot to end it, man.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much for coming out and being a part of the
Thanks,
podcast.
Mike.
Really appreciate it. And you're so interesting. It's fun talking to you.
Thanks for having me. It was an interesting conversation with people that I enjoy being with. And so it was
Very
easy.
cool. Yep.
Pound that like button and subscribe.